So Feser's Augustinian proof crucially relies on the falsity of Platonism. Now, Platonism, as I use it, is just the view that there are mind-independent, necessarily existent, non-spatiotemporal, non-causal, abstract objects such as properties or universals, propositions, mathematical objects, and so on. But as I'm going to hope to show, Feser has failed to justify his reliance on the falsity of Platonism. I can decipher about 6 problems Feser raises for Platonism in his chapter on pages 97 to 99. I'm going to tackle each of these in turn in the following subsections of this video. And I'm also going to tackle an additional problem for Platonism, what I call the Brentano problem, taken from Anderson and Welty, as well as Proust and Rasmussen. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's consider now Feser's 6 problems for Platonism. So the first problem Feser raises is the epistemic access problem. It's also called the Benacerraf problem, after the philosopher Paul Benacerraf. So Feser writes, but what would it be for triangularity in the abstract and all by itself, existing not in an actual material triangle and not in any mind, but somehow as an object in its own right, to cause something? Yet if it has no causal powers and thus no effects on anything, then it would follow that it has no effects on us. And in that case, how could we possibly even know about it? So the idea here, or, I can try to extract an argument here. I mean, it's just a rhetorical question, but, let's try to be charitable. The idea here seems to be that prima facie knowledge requires causal contact with a thing known. The thing known needs to causally impinge on us in some way. But when it comes to Platonic abstracta, causal contact is impossible, right? These things are non-causal. Therefore, if there are Platonic abstracta, we cannot have knowledge of them. Okay, so that's the argument. Let's make do with it. So I have 2 responses or so. So first, I'm not going to pretend to have like a knockdown solution to the Benacerraf problem. But what I will argue, though, is that the Platonists' options are nowhere near as bleak as they would need to be for Feser's criticism to have any teeth. For, plausibly, knowledge doesn't require causal contact with the object of knowledge. There are lots of legitimate ways to acquire knowledge that don't require causal contact. You guys can see, for instance, the end of my discussion with Platonist philosopher Scott Berman, where we address this objection at length, but I'm going to give you the brief version here. So again, there are lots of legitimate ways to acquire knowledge that don't require causal contact. Consider, for instance, inference of the best explanation in the context of Platonism. We certainly have causal contact with ordinary particulars, like tables and chairs and trees and humans and whatnot. Moreover, we observe various facts about them, facts that call out for explanation. For instance, we observe objective resemblances or commonalities among them. We observe the success of science and the fact that certain natural classification schemes seem essential to such predictive, explanatory, and technological success in the sciences, and so on. Finally, we use standard explanatory reasoning, for example, comparing theoretical virtues of the competing explanations, to infer that abstract objects best explain, or as the case may be, provide the only explanation for, the relevant phenomena. None of this requires abstracta to causally impinge on us in some way. And yet this is sure as hell a legitimate way to acquire knowledge thereof. So it's just false. It's false that knowledge requires causal contact. And that's precisely what Feser would need for his first problem to go through here. And so here's my second response to the argument. I would say that plausibly any intuition or argument supporting the thesis that knowledge requires causal contact will equally support the claim that knowledge requires only some explanatory connection with the object or objects of knowledge. But in that case, the Platonists can easily accept that there is an explanatory connection between abstract objects and our belief therein. For instance, according to Scott Berman, abstracta partly explain various features of science itself. And our beliefs about science are themselves explained by such features. For example, science's predictive and explanatory and technological success. By the transitivity of explanation, it follows that abstracta explain, or at least partly explain, our belief therein. Similar things can be said about, for instance, objective resemblance among particulars, right? Abstracta explain, so the story goes, abstracta explain objective resemblance or commonalities among particulars. Such mundane facts about particulars explain our beliefs about those facts, so by transitivity, abstracta partly explain our belief therein. Thus, plausibly, our belief in abstracta is indeed relevantly explanatorily connected to the fact that there are such abstracta. Plausibly, those who mount the Benacerraf problem must likewise admit, moreover, the legitimacy of this kind of transitivity, since obviously not all of our knowledge of ordinary particulars. And so I don't think, for these two reasons, that this argument is convincing at all. So let's move on to the second objection that Feser levels towards Platonism. The first one failed, but maybe the second one won't. So here's how Feser articulates his second problem for Platonism. Quote, furthermore, if an abstract object like triangularity has no effect on anything, then it has no effect on individual material objects, like the triangular billiard ball rack or dinner bell. But in that case, how could it be that which explains why those things fit the particular pattern they do? End quote. Now, again, it's not exactly clear what the argument here is supposed to be. I'm not sure how you can get away with gesturing towards rhetorical questions, but that's not quite an argument. But again, let's be charitable. Maybe it goes something like this: Premise 1: if X has no effect on Y, then X cannot explain facts about Y. Premise 2: Platonic abstracta have no effects on material objects. Premise 3: one fact about material objects is that they fit certain patterns. Conclusion: so Platonic abstracta cannot explain why material objects fit the patterns they do. And so we could go on to say premise 5, but if Platonism is true, they do explain why material objects fit the patterns they do. And so premise 6, Platonism is false. So that's my best rendition of, the argument that Feser's gesturing towards here, or adumbrating here. What do we make of it? So I say that not only does premise 1 seem unmotivated, and not only does Feser, of course, provide no justification thereof, he just gives a kind of rhetorical question. So it seems unmotivated, firstly. And that's enough. I could just move on, right? I could say this is unmotivated. You've given literally no reason for this. Let's move on. I could do that. But I'm also going to argue that it's just straightforwardly false. For there are all sorts of non-causal explanations. That is, cases where X explains Y, or some fact about Y, without having any causal effect on Y. Suppose Stephen is hanging out with two friends, Cameron and Cameron. Suppose Stephen has 23 cookies and wants to give his two friends the same whole number of cookies without any left over. To his dismay, he finds out that he can't do this. What explains that? Well, the explanation is in terms of mathematical constraints, right? 23 cannot be divided by 2 to yield a whole number. Importantly, though, this is not a causal explanation. The relevant non-divisibility of 23 isn't causing Stephen's desire to be unsatisfied. Nevertheless, it still explains it. So premise 1 is just false. The mathematical constraints here have no causal effect on Stephen's desire, but they nevertheless explain some fact or facts about it. Moreover, the explanatory arguments for Platonism themselves constitute responses to premise 1. For instance, suppose the Platonist appeals to some one thing shared in common among numerically distinct individuals in order to explain their objective resemblance with one another. It's not difficult to see how this explains objective resemblance, right? Things resemble because they literally share one and the same thing in common among themselves. And this is explanatorily illuminating, says the Platonist, regardless of whether that one thing shared in common has causal effects on the particulars in question. And so I conclude that Feser's second problem here is not at all a serious challenge for the Platonist. And so onward we march to the third problem. So the third problem is an alleged incoherence in Platonism. So Feser writes, Platonic realism seems to regard a form as something both universal, that is instantiated in many things, and also existing as a particular individual thing in its own right. This seems incoherent. Now, once again, it's not exactly clear what the problem is here. Consider the case of one universal, triangularity, right? This is a universal. It is a single entity. But that doesn't mean that it cannot be universal in the sense of multiply instantiable or exemplifiable. All that amounts to is that numerically distinct individuals can stand in an exemplification relation to it. Now, obviously, there are different accounts of exemplification, but for present purposes, a generic and simplified notion will suffice. There is nothing contradictory or incoherent here, right? It's not as though the universal is both a single entity and not a single entity. There's one entity here to which multiple distinct entities stand in exemplification relations. This is not incoherent. Okay, that's the first problem with this. The second problem is that arguably the same problem, assuming as we shouldn't that it is a problem, the same problem afflicts any realist view of universals, including Feser's theistic conceptualism, right? Any realist view of, for example, the universal triangularity says that there is such a thing as triangularity. That is, that there exists an X such that X is identical to triangularity. To deny this is simply to adopt anti-realism about triangularity, to say, in other words, that there is no such thing. But in that case, we have one thing. triangularity, which is nevertheless in some respect universal. The problem of being both quote unquote individual and quote unquote universal will therefore afflict any realist view, if it is a problem in the first place, which it isn't. But so to make this concrete, pun intended, consider Feser's own theistic conceptualism. Under such a view, universals are ideas in the divine intellect, as Feser says on page 108 of his book. But in that case, Feser's own view treats triangularity as something universal that is present in many things and also existing as a particular individual thing, namely an idea. So this third problem is not challenging at all to the Platonist. It's not plausible. And, let's just move on to the fourth argument. See if so far we have 3 strikes. None of them were plausible, but maybe the fourth one will be. Spoiler, it's not, but, we'll give it a shot. So Feser's fourth argument against Platonism is the so-called third man argument. He writes, take the form of man, for example. Individual men are men only because they participate in this form, says the Platonic realist. But if the form of man is itself an individual object, doesn't that entail that there must be some other form that it participates in, and by reference to which it counts as the form of man specifically? Don't we have to posit a super form of man over and above the form of man, in which both individual men and the form of man itself all participate? Indeed, wouldn't we have to posit a super form of man over and above that super form, in which the form of man, the super form, and individual men participate? We seem led into an infinite regress and absurdity, end quote. Feser missed his opportunity to say super duper form instead of super form, but I guess we can forgive him. So my response is that this is not at all plausible. Something only instantiates or exemplifies or quote unquote participates in the universal manhood if it is an individual, particular, flesh and bones man. But the universal manhood is not a man. Right? For one thing, the former is non-spatiotemporal, while the latter is spatiotemporal. So there is no need, nor could there be need, for some higher order universal, manhood sub 1, that both individual men and manhood itself exemplify. This would only be the case if there were some common or shared feature among individual men and the universal manhood. But there isn't much in common between them, right? The former are concrete flesh and bones, bipedal, rational animals that are featherless, whereas the latter is an abstract, non-causal, non-spatiotemporal universal or property. If they have something in common, it surely won't be anything relevant to some higher order manhood like manhood sub 1. So this problem is not at all plausible. Moreover, and this is my second response, an exactly parallel problem, once again, assuming as we shouldn't that it is a problem, faces Feser's theistic conceptualism, right? Consider the following parody. Take the divine idea of manhood. Individual men are men only because they share or participate in or exemplify this same manhood, says the theistic conceptualist. Right? I mean, universals are often, though not always, posited in part to explain commonalities among individuals. It is therefore only because things have the relevant universal F-ness that they all are F. Hence, if universals are divine ideas, it follows that individual men are men only because they share or have or participate in or exemplify or whatever the divine idea of manhood. Okay, end footnote. So again, we're taking the divine idea of manhood, and individual men are only men because they share or exemplify this same manhood, says the theistic conceptualist. But if manhood is itself an individual divine idea, doesn't that entail that there must be some other divine idea that it participates in, and by reference to which it counts as the idea of manhood specifically? Don't we have to postulate a super divine idea of manhood over and above the divine idea of manhood, in which both individual men and the divine idea of manhood itself all participate? Indeed, wouldn't we have to posit a super divine idea of manhood over and above that super divine idea, in which the divine idea of manhood, the super divine idea, and individual men all participate? We seem led into a vicious regress and absurdity. Like, come on, no, this is not plausible at all. Those two responses, I think, suffice to show that this argument fails, and it's not a problem for the Platonist. And even if it were, it would pose a problem for Feser's own theistic conceptualism. So we're moving on. Okay, sorry. That's my grandma. Okay, so individuality and incoherence. So here's Feser's fifth argument against Platonism. Consider a universal like animality. I'm reading off the screen now. Every individual animal is either rational, as human beings are, or non-rational, as all other animals are. But what about animality itself? Precisely because it is universal, it has to apply to both rational and non-rational animals. But it can't itself include both rationality and non-rationality, for these are contradictory. So we have to say that inherently it entails neither rationality nor non-rationality. But no individual thing can be neither rational nor non-rational. Any existing thing has to be one or the other. Hence, the universal animality cannot be said to exist as an individual thing in its own right. That is to say, it cannot properly be thought of as a Platonic form, end quote. So this is confused. In one sense, the universal animality entails only non-rationality. In another sense, the universal animality entails neither rationality nor non-rationality. There is nothing absurd here, okay? Here is the perfectly respectable sense in which animality entails only non-rationality. The universal itself is not rational, that is, capable of rational deliberation or thought or activity. And hence, the universal itself exemplifies or has the property of non rationality. Or if we want a sparser ontology, we could say it fails to exemplify the universal rationality. So that's the perfectly respectable sense in which animality does in fact entail non-rationality and only non-rationality. But here's the other perfectly respectable sense in which animality entails neither rationality nor non-rationality. That which exemplifies animality does not automatically or else thereby exemplify rationality in particular or non-rationality in particular. In other words, X's exemplification of the property of animality entails neither X's exemplification of the property rationality nor X's exemplification of the property non-rationality. There's nothing contradictory or absurd here. In a fortiori, there is nothing absurd here that results from treating animality as a single entity, as the Platonist does. Finally, and once again, an exactly parallel problem, assuming as we shouldn't that it is a problem, faces Feser's theistic conceptualism. Consider the following parody. As Feser himself argues, we have to say that animality inherently entails neither rationality nor non-rationality, but no divine idea can be neither rational nor non-rational. Whatever exists has to be one or the other. Hence, animality cannot be said to exist as an individual entity, which would have to be the case if it were a divine idea. That is to say, it cannot properly be thought of as an idea in the divine intellect. And so we have these two problems. Firstly, this is just confused. It mistakes the fact that the universal itself does in fact exemplify non-rationality. Yeah, that's the sense in which it's false that animality is neither rational nor non-rational. No, animality is non-rational. It exemplifies the property non-rational or non-rationality. But there's another sense in which, and a perfectly respectable sense, in which animality entails neither rationality nor non-rationality. Not in the sense that it exemplifies neither of those as a universal or as an entity in its own right, but in the sense that those things which themselves exemplify animality do not themselves automatically or thereby exemplify rationality in particular or non-rationality in particular. So that's the first response. This is just confused. And then the second response is that, again, an exactly parallel problem is going to face Feser's view. Okay, 5 strikes, all of them fail, but maybe Feser's 6th argument won't fail. Let's see. Maybe there's hope. So here's Feser's 6th criticism of Platonism. Quoting from the screen here, Platonic realism implies that the natures of the things of our experience are not in the things themselves, but are instead non-spatio-temporal. The nature of a tree, for example, is not to be looked for in the tree itself, but in the form of tree. The nature of a human being is not to be looked for in any human being, but rather in the form of humanity, and so on. Now, if treeness is not to be found in a tree, nor humanity in a human being, then it is hard to see how what we call a tree really exists as a tree, or what we call a human being really exists as a human being, end quote. Now, a familiar pattern, it's not clear what the argument is here, but I guess I can consider some of the claims that he makes. So first, Feser says that the natures are, quote, not to be looked for, end quote, in the things whose natures they are. I mean, perhaps this is simply a statement of the Platonic commitment to the non-spatio-temporality of abstracta. You know, you won't find the universal spatio-temporally located where its instances are. That's correct, but utterly uninteresting, right? It's just a restatement of the Platonic view. Feser does go on to report that it is, quote, hard for him to see, end quote, how this commitment allows us to say that ordinary particulars exist as those particulars. But I myself have to admit that it's hard for me to see how this is at all a convincing argument or problematic for the Platonist, right? Platonists don't deny the reality of the ordinary particulars around us, contemporary analytic Platonists, that is, and nor do they deny that such ordinary particulars have various intrinsic and extrinsic properties. Finally, they also don't or needn't deny that many such intrinsic properties are essential to those particulars. None of this is compromised by the mere fact that the properties of themselves are non-spatio-temporal. There's just no force behind Feser's 6th criticism here. Now, Feser offers what might be interpreted as a seventh criticism when he writes, quote, on page, well, I'm not quoting now, page 99, quote, indeed, the trees and human beings we see are said by Plato merely imperfectly to resemble something else, namely the forms. So what we call a tree seems at the end of the day to be no more genuinely tree-like than a statue or mirror image of a tree is. What we call a human being seems no more genuinely human than a statue or mirror image of a human being is, and so forth. But this is absurd, end quote. Now, of course, this criticism doesn't attack like the actual good versions of Platonism, like contemporary defenders of Platonism and how it's like actually defended by, living scholars. The particulars of our experience, according to this contemporary version of Platonism, do not resemble abstract objects. They have very little in common with abstract objects. Abstract objects are like non-causal, non-spatiotemporal, necessarily existing, but the particulars of our experience usually don't have those properties. So it's just false for this contemporary version of realism that they are ordinary particulars, that is, are imperfect or less real images of these universals. And so this criticism is neither here nor there for present purposes. Okay, so those are all of Feser's 6 arguments against Platonism. He claims in his chapter that his objections to Platonism are, quote, insuperable, end quote. Now, while many adjectives describe his objections, I hope to have shown that insuperable is certainly not one of them. Okay, let's move on.